The husband who tried to cover up the perfect crime at first.
No.
Every time I see pictures of them, I don't know how this could have happened.
It looked like a perfect crime. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no clear motive, just a quiet home, and a wife who was suddenly gone. Her husband seemed calm, cooperative even. He spoke clearly, answered questions, and stayed just composed enough to avoid suspicion. But something didn't sit right, because the more he explained what happened, the more the story started to shift. Small details changed. Timelines didn't quite match, and the version of events he kept repeating felt almost too perfect. For a while it worked, until one tiny inconsistency, so easy to miss, started unraveling everything. And once investigators saw it, they realized this wasn't a mystery, it was a cover-up. In the early hours after she was reported missing, everything seemed strangely controlled. There was no panic in the house, no signs of a struggle.
I loaded my stuff up in my coolers, my water jugs, my book bag, my computers, some of the tools that I had from the toolbox. I knew I was going to have to do some pumping unit rubbers today. That's why I was out so far.
No overturned furniture or broken glass, just silence, and a husband who appeared composed, almost rehearsed.
No.
He doesn't look worried. He looks like he's trying to cover his tracks. But if he's loading his stuff, why isn't he walking back and forth? But I can't see what he's doing in the back of the truck because he pulled into the garage. And he knows my camera's there.
As he explained what had happened. According to him, it was simple. They had gone to bed the night before like any other couple. Nothing unusual. No argument, no tension. When he woke up, she was gone. At first, he thought she might have stepped out, maybe for a walk, maybe to clear her head. But as time passed, concern grew. That's when he decided to call it in. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, but investigators are trained to listen beyond the words. From the beginning, there were subtle inconsistencies, not enough to accuse, just enough to notice. The way he described the timeline felt too clean, too structured. Real memories tend to be messy. People hesitate, correct themselves, recall details out of order. But his version flowed almost perfectly, as if it had been practiced. Still, there was no direct evidence.
I denied it, as she desired, and I feel horrible for it. Like, she was pregnant, and Scott fell in love with her. Absolutely. I mean, that's God's honest truth.
So the investigation followed procedure. Officers canvassed the area. Neighbors were questioned. Nearby cameras were reviewed. Friends and family were contacted to understand her recent behavior. And that's where the first cracks appeared. People close to her described tension in the relationship. Nothing explosive, but enough to suggest things weren't as calm as he claimed. Small disagreements, subtle changes in behavior. Enough to challenge the image of a peaceful night he had presented. Then came the timeline. Investigators began reconstructing the hours leading up to her disappearance, minute by minute.
I know. I didn't know what else to do. I was so scared.
I know.
Phone records, digital activity, movements in and around the house. And slowly the story he told started to drift away from what the data showed.
It's some of it's hard to believe that your wife did it, right? You can imagine that. Okay.
Certain times didn't line up. Moments he described didn't have supporting evidence. Activities he claimed couldn't be verified. Again, nothing definitive. But the pattern was building. What made it more unsettling was how steady he remained. No visible cracks under pressure. No emotional breakdown. He answered questions, cooperated with requests, and stayed consistent, at least on the surface. But consistency doesn't always mean truth. Sometimes it means control. As forensic teams examined the home more closely, they began focusing on what wasn't there. Not what was visible, but what was missing. Traces that should have existed, didn't. In situations like this, absence can be just as revealing as presence. There were areas that appeared unusually clean. Not spotless in a normal sense, but selectively so, as if certain spaces had been wiped down more carefully than others.
I mean, you knew what was going to happen.
That raised a new possibility. Not that something had happened there, but that something had been removed. Investigators expanded their analysis. Specialized techniques were used. Method designed to detect what the eye can't see. and while the results weren't immediately conclusive, they pointed in one direction. This wasn't just a disappearance. Something had occurred inside that house. Meanwhile, outside the home, another layer of the case was taking shape: digital footprints, phones, messages, search histories, tiny pieces of behavior that people often forget about. Unlike spoken words, they don't adjust under pressure. They remain fixed, recording actions exactly as they happened. And what those records revealed.
Over, and then I was just like right there on top of her.
Okay. And then you're talking while you're on top of her?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That seems confusing to me.
Didn't match his story. There were gaps, unexplained activity, moments where his behavior contradicted what he had told investigators. At this stage, suspicion wasn't just growing, it was stabilizing. But there was still one major problem: no body, no clear cause, no direct proof. And without that, the case remained suspended between possibility and certainty. The husband continued to maintain his version of events.
About like that I call it good.
Calm, controlled, unshaken, as if the story he created could hold everything together. But what he didn't realize was this: it wasn't the big details that were going to expose him. It was the small ones, the ones he thought no one would notice. And investigators were getting closer to finding exactly where the story broke.
Okay.
By the time investigators reached that point, the case had shifted completely. It was no longer about finding a missing person. It was about proving what had already begun to feel true. But proving it required something stronger than suspicion. They needed a break, and it came from something almost invisible. During a deeper forensic sweep of the home, specialists revisited areas that had already been examined once before. This time, they weren't looking for obvious signs. They were looking for what had been hidden. Using advanced detection methods, they uncovered faint traces in places that seemed unusually clean. Patterns that didn't match normal household activity. Marks that suggested something had been wiped away, but not completely. That was the first real shift, because now, investigators weren't just questioning his story. They were starting to replace it. At the same time, digital evidence continued to build pressure. His phone activity told a different version of events, one that didn't align with the calm timeline he had repeated from the beginning. There were searches, movements, and unexplained gaps that pointed to preparation rather than confusion. And then came the detail that changed everything: a small inconsistency in his timeline, something he had mentioned early on without much thought. At first, it seemed insignificant, just a minor detail in a long explanation. But when investigators tested it against the evidence, it didn't hold, not even close. Once that piece collapsed, everything else began to follow. Because his story depended on precision. Every part had to fit perfectly. And the moment one detail broke, it exposed how constructed the entire narrative really was. From there, the investigation accelerated. Mitch's efforts expanded beyond the home. Areas connected to his movements were re-examined. Locations that once seemed unrelated suddenly became relevant, and eventually, the truth surfaced. What had been missing was no longer missing. The discovery confirmed what investigators had suspected all along. This was never a disappearance, it was a crime. One that had been carefully planned, then carefully covered. The arrest that followed didn't come as a dramatic shock. It came as a conclusion, a quiet end to a story that had been slowly unraveling from the very beginning. When he was finally confronted with the evidence, the composure that had defined him started to fade. Not all at once, but enough to show that the control he relied on was slipping, because control only works when no one sees through it. And now, everyone did. For those who knew the couple, the reality was difficult to process. What had seemed like an ordinary relationship now carried a hidden layer no one had fully seen. Moments were reinterpreted. Conversations remembered differently. Small signs that once felt harmless now carried weight. But for investigators, the case became something else entirely, a reminder that the most convincing stories aren't always the true ones. That sometimes the idea of a perfect crime is built on one assumption, that no one will look closely enough. But someone always does, and in this case, it wasn't a major mistake that exposed him. It was the smallest inconsistency, the one detail he thought would never matter, the one thing he didn't plan for. Because no matter how carefully a story is constructed, the truth doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs one way in. If this story made you think about how easily appearances can be controlled, how something can look calm on the surface while hiding something much darker, then you're already seeing what most people miss. Because the most chilling cases aren't always about what's obvious. They're about what's hidden in plain sight. So if you want more real stories, deeper breakdowns, and cases that stay with you long after they end, make sure you like this video. Share it with someone who loves uncovering the truth, and subscribe to the channel, because the next story might be closer than it seems.